The humid air of the military base hung thick with tension as Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez walked across the compound, her boots clicking against the concrete with precise military rhythm. At 28, she had earned every stripe on her uniform through blood, sweat, and countless hours of proving herself in a world dominated by men. But nothing could have prepared her for what was about to unfold in the next 60 seconds. Behind her, Petty Officer First Class Jake Morrison, a decorated Navy SEAL with 3 combat deployments under his belt, muttered something under his breath that would change both their lives forever. His words, caught by the desert wind, would soon echo through the highest levels of military command and teach everyone present a lesson about respect, rank, and the true meaning of military brotherhood. What started as a routine morning briefing was about to become a defining moment that would be retold in military academies for years to come. Because sometimes the most powerful lessons come not from the battlefield, but from the courage to stand up for what's right, even when the odds seem impossible. This is the true story of how one woman's quiet dignity in the face of disrespect brought 4 of the nation's most powerful military leaders to their feet in a moment that would redefine everything everyone thought they knew about leadership, honor, and the unbreakable bonds that hold our military together. The sun was barely visible over the horizon at Forward Operating Base Alpha when Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez began her morning routine. At 0500 hours, while most of the base was still wrapped in the quiet darkness of early dawn, Maria was already in the communications center, reviewing intelligence reports that had come in during the night shift. Her small hands moved quickly across the keyboard, cross-referencing satellite imagery with field reports from units scattered across the region. Maria had been stationed at FOB Alpha for 8 months, serving as the senior intelligence analyst for a joint task force operation that brought together soldiers, Marines, sailors, and airmen from different branches of the military. Her job required her to process and analyze critical information that could mean the difference between life and death for troops in the field. Every morning, she prepared detailed briefings for the command staff, ensuring that all relevant intelligence was communicated clearly and efficiently. The daughter of immigrants from El Salvador, Maria had joined the Army at 18 with dreams of serving her country and proving that a young Latino woman could excel in the military. Her parents had worked double shifts at a textile factory to support their family, and Maria carried their work ethic with her every day. She had graduated at the top of her intelligence analyst school, earned commendations for her work in 2 previous deployments, and had recently been promoted to staff sergeant ahead of her peers. But success had not come without challenges. In her 7 years of service, Maria had faced skepticism, inappropriate comments, and subtle forms of discrimination that she had learned to handle with professionalism and grace. She believed deeply that her work spoke for itself, and she focused on excelling at her duties rather than engaging in conflicts with those who questioned her abilities or her place in the military. This particular morning felt different somehow. There was an electricity in the air that suggested something significant was about to happen. Maria had noticed increased radio chatter from higher headquarters over the past few days, and rumor had it that some very important visitors were coming to the base. She had heard whispers about a surprise inspection or evaluation, but nobody seemed to have concrete information about what was planned. At 0630 hours, as Maria was putting the finishing touches on her intelligence summary, the communications center door opened and in walked Petty Officer First Class Jake Morrison. Jake was a Navy SEAL who had been assigned to the base as part of Special Operations Liaison Team. At 32, he was a veteran of 3 combat deployments and carried himself with the confidence that came from years of elite military training. Jake had a reputation among the troops as someone who was extremely competent in his field, but also someone who held very traditional views about military hierarchy and gender roles. He had grown up in a small town in Texas, joined the Navy straight out of high school, and had spent his entire adult life in the masculine culture of Special Operations Forces. While he was respectful in his interactions with Maria, there was always an underlying tension that suggested he was not entirely comfortable taking direction from a female non-commissioned officer. "Morning, Rodriguez," Jake said, using her last name in the casual way that was common among military personnel. Got anything interesting in the intelligence reports today? Maria looked up from her computer screen and nodded professionally. Good morning, Petty Officer Morrison. Actually, yes. We received some significant signals intelligence overnight that indicates possible enemy movement in Sector 7. I'm including it in this morning's briefing for the command staff. Jake leaned against the doorframe and crossed his arms. You sure about that intelligence? Sometimes these analysts at higher headquarters get a little jumpy about radio traffic that doesn't really mean anything. The comment stung a little, but Maria maintained her composure. She had learned early in her career that responding defensively to such remarks usually made situations worse. Instead, she simply said, I've cross-referenced the signals intelligence with 3 other sources, including human intelligence from our assets in the area and imagery analysis from yesterday's reconnaissance flights. I'm confident in the assessment. Well, I hope you're right, Jake replied with a slight shrug. The last thing we need is to get everyone worked up over nothing. Before Maria could respond, the radio crackled to life with an urgent message from the base communications operator. All personnel, this is base operations. We have VIP movement inbound to FOB Alpha. ETA, 15 minutes. All section chiefs report to the briefing room immediately for VIP briefing preparation. This is not a drill. Jake straightened up immediately, his casual demeanor replaced by the focused attention of a professional soldier. VIPs? Do you know who's coming? Maria quickly saved her work and began gathering her briefing materials. Negative, but based on the short notice and the urgency, it has to be someone significant. We'd better get to the briefing room. As they both headed toward the door, Maria felt a familiar mix of nervousness and excitement. VIP visits were always stressful because they meant that everything had to be perfect, but they were also opportunities to showcase the important work that the intelligence section was doing. She had briefed colonels and even a few generals before, and while it was always intimidating, she had learned to channel her nervous energy into focused preparation. The briefing room was already buzzing with activity when they arrived. Officers and senior enlisted personnel from various sections were setting up displays, checking equipment, and reviewing their presentations. Major Williams, the base executive officer, was in the center of the room coordinating the preparation efforts. Listen up, everyone, Major Williams announced loudly enough to get everyone's attention. We have 4 general officers inbound for an unannounced inspection and evaluation. This includes Lieutenant General Patterson from Army Forces Command, Major General Thompson from Marine Forces Central, Rear Admiral Davis from Naval Special Warfare Command, and Brigadier General Martinez from Air Force Special Operations. A murmur went through the room. Having 4 generals from different services arrive simultaneously was extremely unusual and suggested that this visit was about something much more significant than a routine inspection. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, Major Williams continued, looking directly at Maria, you'll be giving the intelligence briefing to the generals. I need you to be ready to present a comprehensive overview of the current threat situation in our area of operations. Yes, sir, Maria replied crisply. I have the current intelligence summary prepared and ready to present. Jake, who had been standing near the back of the room, stepped forward slightly. Sir, with respect, shouldn't someone with more experience be giving the briefing to 4 general officers? Maybe someone from the S2 shop at brigade level. Major Williams looked at Jake with surprise. Petty Officer Morrison, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez is the senior intelligence analyst for this task force and has been preparing these briefings for 8 months. She's the subject matter expert on the intelligence picture in our area of operations. I understand that, sir, Jake replied, but these are general officers from multiple services. Maybe it would be more appropriate to have someone with a higher rank or more experience dealing with senior leadership. The room had gone very quiet, and Maria could feel all eyes on her. This was exactly the kind of situation she had hoped to avoid. She knew that Jake's comment, while ostensibly about experience and protocol, was really about his discomfort with her being in a position of authority and responsibility. Petty Officer Morrison, Major Williams said firmly, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez has briefed general officers before and has consistently provided outstanding intelligence support to this command. She will be giving the briefing. Jake nodded reluctantly, but said nothing more. However, as the room began to disperse and people returned to their preparation tasks, Maria heard him mutter something under his breath to another sailor standing nearby. The words were spoken quietly, but in the acoustics of the briefing room, they carried clearly to where Maria was standing. I guess we'll see how well the Army's diversity programs work when she's trying to explain complex intelligence to real war fighters. The words hit Maria like a physical blow, not just because of what Jake had said, but because of the implication that her position was somehow the result of preferential treatment rather than her own merit and hard work. She felt her face flush with a combination of anger and embarrassment, but she forced herself to remain professional and continue with her preparation. What Jake didn't know, and what nobody in that room could have anticipated, was that his comment had been overheard by someone else entirely. Standing just outside the briefing room, having arrived early for a preliminary assessment of the base facilities, was Colonel Sarah Mitchell, aide-de-camp to Lieutenant General Patterson. Colonel Mitchell had heard every word of Jake's comment and had immediately understood its implications. More importantly, what none of them knew was that this entire visit had been triggered by concerns about morale and unit cohesion that had been reported up through various channels over the past several months. The four generals were not there for a routine inspection. They were there to evaluate the leadership climate and the effectiveness of joint operations in a deployed environment. As Maria continued her preparation, checking and double-checking her slides and rehearsing her key points, she had no idea that the events of the next hour would change not just her own career, but would become a defining moment in the ongoing evolution of military culture and leadership. The sound of helicopters approaching in the distance signaled that the VIPs were about to arrive, and Maria took a deep breath to center herself. She had worked too hard and come too far to let anyone's doubts about her capabilities affect her performance. Whatever happened next, she was determined to represent herself, her unit, and her service with the professionalism and competence that had brought her to this point in her career. Outside, the helicopters were landing, and the most senior military leadership any of them had ever encountered was about to walk through the door. The rhythmic thump of helicopter rotors grew louder as the VIP aircraft approached the landing zone at FOB Alpha. From the windows of the briefing room, the assembled personnel could see two Black Hawk helicopters circling the base before settling down in perfect formation on the designated landing pad. Even from a distance, there was something unmistakably authoritative about the way the aircraft moved and positioned themselves. Maria stood at the front of the briefing room, her presentation materials organized and ready, but her mind kept returning to Jake's comment from earlier. She had spent years building her reputation through careful work and professional excellence, and the suggestion that her position was somehow unearned felt like a betrayal of everything she had worked toward. But she pushed those thoughts aside and focused on the task ahead. 4 general officers were about to walk through that door, and her job was to provide them with the best possible intelligence briefing. Major Williams positioned himself near the entrance to the briefing room, while the other personnel arranged themselves according to protocol for receiving senior visitors. The tension in the room was palpable as everyone adjusted their uniforms one final time and prepared for what would undoubtedly be an intense and detailed evaluation of their work. Through the window, they could see a small convoy of vehicles moving from the landing zone toward the headquarters building. The convoy included 2 armored SUVs and a Humvee, with military police providing security escort. It was the kind of arrival that spoke to both the importance of the visitors and the serious nature of their mission. The first person to enter the briefing room was Colonel Sarah Mitchell, a tall woman with graying hair and the bearing of someone who had spent decades in positions of significant responsibility. As aide-de-camp to Lieutenant General Patterson, she was responsible for coordinating the general schedule and ensuring that all meetings and briefings were conducted efficiently and professionally. Colonel Mitchell's eyes swept the room quickly, taking in the setup and the personnel present. Her gaze lingered for a moment on Maria, who stood ready at the briefing podium, and then moved on to assess the overall readiness of the presentation. "Good morning," Colonel Mitchell announced to the room. The general officers will be conducting individual meetings with section chiefs over the next 2 hours, followed by a comprehensive briefing on current operations and intelligence. I need everyone to be prepared for detailed questions about their areas of responsibility. Behind Colonel Mitchell, the 4 general officers entered the room in order of seniority. Lieutenant General Patterson, a distinguished-looking man in his late 50s with silver hair and combat ribbons that spoke to a career of significant achievements, led the group. His presence commanded immediate attention, and everyone in the room snapped to attention automatically. Following him was Major General Thompson from the Marine Corps, a compact man with the weathered look of someone who had spent considerable time in field operations. Rear Admiral Davis, representing Naval Special Warfare Command, carried himself with a quiet confidence typical of the Naval Special Operations community. Finally, Brigadier General Martinez from Air Force Special Operations completed the group, her presence as the only female general officer particularly notable to Maria. At ease, Lieutenant General Patterson said in a voice that carried easily through the room, "We're here to get an honest assessment of your operations and capabilities. We're not looking for a dog and pony show. We want to understand how you're accomplishing your mission and what challenges you're facing." Major Williams stepped forward to begin the formal introductions and overview of the base operations. "General Patterson, we're honored to have you and your colleagues here at FOB Alpha. We have a comprehensive briefing prepared that covers our current operations, intelligence picture, and operational challenges." "Excellent," Lieutenant General Patterson replied. "We'd like to start with the intelligence briefing. Understanding the current threat environment is essential to evaluating everything else you're doing here." Maria felt her heart rate increase slightly as all attention turned toward her. She had briefed senior officers before, but never in front of such a distinguished group of leaders from multiple services. She stepped forward and introduced herself professionally. "Good morning, generals. I'm Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, Senior Intelligence Analyst for the Joint Task Force. I have a comprehensive intelligence briefing prepared covering the current threat picture in our area of operations." As Maria began her presentation, she could feel the intense attention of the 4 general officers. Lieutenant General Patterson took notes on a small notepad, while Major General Thompson leaned forward slightly, clearly focused on every detail she was presenting. Rear Admiral Davis asked several technical questions about the sources and methods behind the intelligence assessments, demonstrating the kind of detailed understanding that came from years of experience with special operations intelligence. Maria had prepared meticulously for this briefing, and her confidence grew as she moved through her presentation. She explained the complex web of intelligence indicators that suggested increased enemy activity in several sectors, presented detailed analysis of communication intercepts, and provided recommendations for adjusted patrol patterns and security measures based on the current threat assessment. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, Brigadier General Martinez interjected during a pause in the presentation. "Walk me through your assessment methodology for human intelligence sources. How do you validate and cross-reference information from assets in the field?" Maria launched into a detailed explanation of source validation procedures, demonstrating not just her knowledge of the technical aspects of intelligence analysis, but also her understanding of the operational implications of intelligence assessments. She explained how field reports were correlated with signals intelligence, how imagery analysis supported or contradicted human intelligence, and how potential bias and reliability issues were factored into final assessments. Throughout her presentation, Maria was aware that Jake was standing at the back of the room with several other enlisted personnel. She could not see his face from her position at the podium, but she was conscious of his presence and wondered what he was thinking about her performance in front of the senior leadership. As Maria concluded her presentation, Lieutenant General Patterson leaned back in his chair and looked around at his fellow general officers. There was a moment of quiet discussion among them before he spoke. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, that was an excellent briefing. Your analysis is thorough, your methodology is sound, and your recommendations are tactically relevant. You clearly have a strong grasp of the intelligence picture and its operational implications." "Thank you, sir," Maria replied, feeling a surge of pride and relief that her presentation had been well received. Major General Thompson nodded in agreement. The level of detail and the quality of analysis demonstrates exactly the kind of intelligence support that our forces need in this environment. Well done. It was at this moment that Colonel Mitchell, who had been standing near the back of the room during the briefing, approached Lieutenant General Patterson and whispered something in his ear. The general's expression changed slightly, becoming more serious and focused. What the others in the room did not know was that Colonel Mitchell was reporting what she had overheard earlier regarding Jake's comment about diversity programs and Maria's qualifications. The 4 general officers had come to FOB Alpha specifically to assess unit morale, leadership climate, and the effectiveness of integration efforts across the joint force. Reports of tension and discrimination had reached the highest levels of military leadership, and this visit was part of a broader effort to address these issues. Lieutenant General Patterson stood up from his chair and looked around the room. Before we move on to the next briefing, I'd like to have a few words with the entire group here. The room became very quiet, as everyone sensed that something significant was about to happen. The general's tone had shifted from the professional but relaxed demeanor he had maintained during the briefing to something more serious and authoritative. Leadership, Lieutenant General Patterson began, is not about rank alone. It's not about how long you've been in the service, what your background is, or what assumptions people might make about your capabilities based on your appearance or demographics. Jake, standing at the back of the room, felt a growing sense of unease as the general continued speaking. Something about the direction of this conversation suggested that it was connected to events earlier in the morning, though he couldn't quite put together how the general might have learned about his comments. True leadership, the general continued, is demonstrated through competence, professionalism, and the ability to accomplish the mission regardless of personal challenges or obstacles. What we just witnessed was an example of exceptional leadership from a non-commissioned officer who clearly knows her job, takes it seriously, and performs it with distinction. Lieutenant General Patterson's eyes swept the room, making brief eye contact with many of the personnel present, including Jake. In my 32 years of military service, I have learned that some of our most effective leaders are those who have had to overcome additional challenges to prove themselves. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez has just demonstrated exactly the kind of professional competence and leadership that our military needs at every level. The room remained completely silent as everyone absorbed the implications of what the general was saying. It was becoming clear that this was not just a general comment about leadership, but was directed at specific issues within the unit. What I will not tolerate, Lieutenant General Patterson continued, his voice becoming firmer, is any suggestion that a soldier's position or authority is the result of anything other than their merit and their ability to do the job. Any implication that diversity and inclusion efforts somehow compromise our standards or place unqualified people in positions of responsibility is not only wrong, but it's harmful to unit cohesion and military effectiveness. Jake felt his stomach drop as he realized that somehow his earlier comment had been reported to the senior leadership. The implications for his career began to sink in as he understood that he had just been indirectly but clearly addressed by a 3-star general in front of his peers and colleagues. The other 3 general officers were nodding in agreement with Lieutenant General Patterson's words, and Brigadier General Martinez stepped forward to add her own perspective. Excellence, Brigadier General Martinez said, comes in many forms and from many backgrounds. Our military is stronger when we recognize and develop talent wherever we find it, and when we ensure that all of our people have the opportunity to contribute their best efforts to the mission. Maria, still standing at the front of the room, felt a complex mix of emotions. On one hand, she was gratified to receive such strong public support from such senior leadership. On the other hand, she was somewhat embarrassed to be at the center of what was clearly a disciplinary moment for someone else in the room. What none of them could have anticipated was that this moment was about to become even more dramatic and significant, as the 4 general officers had decided that a simple verbal correction was not sufficient to address the underlying issues they had come to investigate. The atmosphere in the briefing room had become electric with tension as Lieutenant General Patterson's words hung in the air. Everyone present understood that they were witnessing something far more significant than a routine VIP visit. The four general officers stood at the front of the room with expressions that conveyed both authority and disappointment, while the assembled personnel waited to see what would happen next. Jake Morrison felt sweat beginning to form on his forehead, despite the air conditioning in the room. His mind was racing as he tried to understand how his comment had reached the ears of the senior leadership so quickly. He began to realize that this entire visit might not have been the routine inspection he had assumed, but rather something much more targeted and specific. Colonel Mitchell stepped forward and addressed the room directly. What we're about to discuss is the reason why this visit was arranged. Over the past several months, reports have reached the highest levels of our respective services regarding climate and morale issues in joint operations environments. These reports have suggested that we have ongoing problems with respect, professionalism, and equal treatment of all service members regardless of their background or demographics. Lieutenant General Patterson nodded and continued the explanation. We're here today not just to assess your operational capabilities, which are clearly excellent, but to address fundamental questions about military culture and leadership that affect the effectiveness of our entire force structure. Major Williams, who had been standing at attention near the side of the room, looked confused and concerned. As the executive officer of the base, he was responsible for maintaining good order and discipline, and the suggestion that there were significant climate issues under his watch was deeply troubling. Sir, Major Williams said carefully, if there are specific issues that need to be addressed, I would appreciate the opportunity to investigate and take appropriate action. Major Williams, Rear Admiral Davis replied, the issues we're addressing today are not primarily a reflection of your leadership, but rather represent broader cultural challenges that affect our entire military. However, what happens in the next few minutes will be a test of how effectively your leadership responds to these challenges when they're brought to your attention. The Admiral's words created an even deeper sense of anticipation in the room as everyone waited to see what specific incident or issue was about to be addressed. Maria, still standing near the briefing podium, began to understand that her morning interaction with Jake was somehow connected to this moment. Brigadier General Martinez addressed the room directly, her voice carrying the authority that came from her position as one of the most senior female officers in the Air Force. This morning, before our arrival was announced to the base personnel, one of our advanced team members overheard a comment that perfectly exemplifies the kind of thinking that undermines military effectiveness and violates our core values. Jake felt his heart begin to race as he realized that his worst fears were about to be confirmed. Somehow, his comment about diversity programs had been overheard and reported to the visiting leadership. The career implications of this situation began to dawn on him as he understood that he was about to be called out in front of four general officers and his entire unit. The comment, Brigadier General Martinez continued, suggested that Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's position and authority were the result of diversity programs rather than her professional competence and merit. This comment represents exactly the kind of thinking that we cannot and will not tolerate in our military. The silence in the room was deafening. Everyone now understood what was happening and why the senior leadership was addressing this issue so directly and publicly. Maria felt a mixture of embarrassment and vindication as she realized that her professional competence was being defended at the highest levels of military leadership. Lieutenant General Patterson stepped forward, and his voice took on a tone that every person in the room recognized as the voice of absolute authority. Petty Officer Morrison stepped forward. Jake felt his legs become weak as he realized that he was about to face direct confrontation with four of the most senior military officers he had ever encountered. Every instinct told him to try to find some way to minimize or explain away his comment, but he also knew that the only appropriate response was to accept responsibility for what he had said. "Yes, sir," Jake replied as he moved through the room toward where the general officers were standing. He could feel the eyes of every person in the room on him as he walked, and he tried to maintain his military bearing despite the overwhelming stress of the situation. When Jake reached the front of the room, Lieutenant General Patterson looked him directly in the eyes with an expression that conveyed both disappointment and authority. Petty Officer Morrison, do you have something you'd like to say about your comment regarding Staff Sergeant Rodriguez and diversity programs? Jake knew that this was a moment that would define not just the rest of this day, but potentially the rest of his military career. He had two choices. He could try to defend or minimize his comment, or he could acknowledge that what he had said was wrong and take responsibility for it. Sir, Jake said, his voice somewhat shaky but clear, I made an inappropriate comment that was disrespectful to Staff Sergeant Rodriguez and did not reflect the values of our military. I was wrong, and I accept full responsibility for what I said. Lieutenant General Patterson nodded slightly, acknowledging Jake's acceptance of responsibility, but his expression remained serious. Petty Officer Morrison, your comment revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what makes our military effective. It suggested that inclusion and diversity somehow compromise our standards rather than strengthen our capabilities. Major General Thompson stepped forward to add his perspective. Petty Officer Morrison, in my 28 years of service, I have seen our military become more effective, not less effective, as we have become more inclusive and more focused on developing talent regardless of background. The suggestion that a decorated non-commissioned officer's position is somehow unearned is not just wrong, it's harmful to military effectiveness. Rear Admiral Davis, representing the Naval Special Warfare community that Jake belonged to, looked particularly disappointed as he addressed the situation. Petty Officer Morrison, the SEAL community prides itself on selecting and developing the best possible operators regardless of any factor other than their ability to accomplish the mission. Your comment suggests a mindset that is inconsistent with those values. Jake felt the weight of disappointment from the senior leadership of his own community and understood that his comment had not just been inappropriate, but had reflected poorly on the entire special operations community that he represented. It was at this point that Lieutenant General Patterson made a decision that surprised everyone in the room. Instead of simply delivering a reprimand or initiating disciplinary action, he decided to use this moment as a teaching opportunity that would have lasting impact on everyone present. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, Lieutenant General Patterson said, turning toward Maria, I want you to understand something very clearly. Your briefing this morning was exceptional not because of any program or policy, but because you are an exceptional intelligence analyst who has earned your position through professional competence. Maria felt a surge of emotion as she heard this validation from such a senior leader, but she maintained her military composure and simply replied, Thank you, sir. Lieutenant General Patterson continued, but more than that, I want you to know that you represent the very best of what our military can be when we focus on developing talent and recognizing excellence wherever we find it. The general then turned back to address the entire room. What we're going to do now is demonstrate something that I believe will be memorable for everyone present and will serve as a reminder of what we value as a military organization. The four general officers looked at each other and seemed to reach some kind of unspoken agreement. What happened next was completely unprecedented in the experience of everyone in the room and would be talked about for years to come. Lieutenant General Patterson turned to face Maria directly and came to the position of attention. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, for your exceptional performance of duty, your professional competence, and your representation of the highest standards of military service, it is my privilege to render honors. The three-star general then executed a perfect military salute directed at Maria, a staff sergeant with 7 years of service. The implications of this gesture were immediately understood by everyone in the room. A lieutenant general does not salute a staff sergeant under normal military protocol, but this was a deliberate demonstration of respect for professional excellence and a repudiation of any suggestion that Maria's position was unearned. What happened next was even more remarkable. Major General Thompson, Rear Admiral Davis, and Brigadier General Martinez all came to attention and rendered the same salute to Maria, creating a moment that would be remembered by everyone present for the rest of their careers. The sight of four general officers saluting a staff sergeant was so unprecedented that many of the people in the room were unsure how to react. Maria, recognizing that she needed to respond appropriately to the salute, came to attention and returned the salute with the same precision and professionalism that she brought to everything she did. Jake, standing at the front of the room and witnessing this extraordinary demonstration of respect and recognition, felt a profound sense of shame and regret for his earlier comment. He began to understand not just that he had been wrong, but that he had missed something fundamental about what makes the military effective and what makes individual soldiers worthy of respect and recognition. The moment stretched on for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds, as four of the most senior military officers any of them had ever encountered held their salutes to demonstrate a principle that they believed was essential to military effectiveness and military values. When the salute was finally completed and the general officers returned to a relaxed position, Lieutenant General Patterson addressed the room one final time before moving on to the rest of their scheduled activities. "What you have just witnessed," the general said, "is not about protocol or rank structure. It's about recognizing excellence and ensuring that every member of our military understands that their worth and their authority come from their professional competence and their commitment to the mission, not from any other factor." The aftermath of the unprecedented salute left the briefing room in stunned silence. The visual image of four general officers rendering honors to a staff sergeant had created a moment that transcended normal military protocol and spoke to something much deeper about values, respect, and the true meaning of military leadership. Everyone present understood that they had just witnessed something that would be talked about and remembered for years to come. Maria stood at attention for several seconds after returning the salute, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. In 7 years of military service, she had never experienced anything approaching this level of public recognition and validation from senior leadership. The gesture was powerful not just because of the rank of the officers involved, but because it represented a clear and unambiguous statement about merit, competence, and the value of professional excellence. Jake remained at the front of the room, feeling the full weight of the lesson that had just been demonstrated. The contrast between his dismissive comment earlier in the morning and the extraordinary respect that had just been shown to Maria could not have been more stark or more instructive. He was beginning to understand that his comment had not just been inappropriate in terms of military courtesy, but had reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of what makes soldiers valuable and worthy of respect. Lieutenant General Patterson allowed the moment to settle before addressing the room again. His voice carried the authority of his rank, but also the wisdom that came from 3 decades of military leadership experience. "What we have just demonstrated," the general said, "is the difference between leadership that is based on position and leadership that is based on competence and character. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez has earned the respect that she just received through her professional excellence and her commitment to the mission. That respect is not diminished by her rank, her background, or any other factor that some people might focus on instead of her actual performance." Major General Thompson stepped forward to add his own perspective to the lesson. "In the Marine Corps, we have a saying that respect is earned, not given. What we've just demonstrated is that respect flows in all directions when it is based on professional competence and character. Senior leaders should never hesitate to recognize and honor excellence wherever they find it, regardless of the rank or background of the person demonstrating that excellence." Rear Admiral Davis nodded in agreement and addressed Jake directly. "Petty Officer Morrison, the Special Operations community has always prided itself on being a meritocracy where performance is the only thing that matters. Your comment this morning suggested a mindset that is inconsistent with those values and that undermines the effectiveness of our teams." Jake felt the disappointment in the Admiral's voice and knew that he needed to respond appropriately. "Admiral, you're absolutely right. I let my personal biases cloud my judgment, and I failed to recognize the professional excellence that was right in front of me. I was wrong, and I understand that my comment was inconsistent with the values of our military and our community." The Admiral acknowledged Jake's response with a slight nod, but his expression remained serious. "Petty Officer Morrison, recognizing that you were wrong is a good first step, but understanding why you were wrong and ensuring that this mindset doesn't continue is what really matters for your development as a leader. Brigadier General Martinez, as the only female general officer present, and someone who had undoubtedly faced her own challenges in rising to senior leadership, had a particularly important perspective to offer on the situation. What happened here this morning, Brigadier General Martinez said, represents challenges that are faced by service members throughout our military every day. There are people who have to prove themselves over and over again because others make assumptions about their capabilities based on factors that have nothing to do with their professional competence. The general's words resonated through the room as people began to think about their own experiences and observations. Many of the service members present had witnessed or experienced similar situations where assumptions about capability were made based on demographics rather than performance. The cost of these assumptions, Brigadier General Martinez continued, is not just personal. It's operational. When we fail to recognize and develop talent because of our biases, we make our entire organization less effective. When we create environments where people have to constantly prove themselves because of who they are rather than what they do, we waste energy and potential that could be directed toward mission accomplishment. Lieutenant General Patterson decided to use this moment to provide some broader context for why this issue was so important to senior military leadership. The reason that we are here today and the reason that this issue is receiving attention at the highest levels of our respective services is because we understand that our military effectiveness depends on our ability to attract, develop, and retain the best possible people regardless of their background. The general paused to let this point sink in before continuing. In an era where we are competing with civilian organizations for the most talented people in our society, we cannot afford to create barriers or obstacles for anyone who has the capability and commitment to serve effectively. Every time someone like Staff Sergeant Rodriguez has to overcome additional challenges because of other people's assumptions, we risk losing talent that our military needs. Major Williams, who had been listening carefully to this discussion, stepped forward to ask a question that was on many people's minds. Sir, what can we do at the unit level to address these issues and ensure that we're creating the kind of environment where everyone can perform at their best? Lieutenant General Patterson looked around at his fellow general officers before responding, suggesting that this was something they had discussed extensively in their planning for this visit. Major Williams, that's exactly the right question, and it's why we're here. This is not just about addressing one incident or one comment. It's about creating sustainable change in military culture that supports excellence and inclusion at every level. Major General Thompson took the lead in answering the question. At the unit level, it starts with leadership that models the behavior and attitudes that you want to see throughout the organization. It means making it clear that professional competence is the only acceptable standard for respect and recognition, and that assumptions based on demographics or background are not just inappropriate, but harmful to mission accomplishment. Rear Admiral Davis added his own perspective from the special operations community. It also means being willing to have difficult conversations when these issues arise, rather than ignoring them or hoping they'll resolve themselves. What happened here this morning could have been handled quietly, but we chose to address it publicly because we believe that public demonstrations of values are more effective than private corrections. The discussion continued for another 20 minutes as the senior officers provided practical guidance on creating inclusive environments, addressing bias and assumptions, and developing talent regardless of background. The conversation covered everything from mentorship programs to performance evaluation processes to the importance of diverse role models in leadership positions. Throughout this discussion, Maria remained largely silent, listening carefully to the guidance being provided, but feeling somewhat overwhelmed by being at the center of such a significant conversation about military culture and values. She had joined the military to serve her country and had worked hard to excel in her chosen field, but she had never expected to become a symbol in broader discussions about inclusion and respect. Jake also remained quiet during most of the discussion, but he was clearly absorbing every word and thinking deeply about the implications for his own leadership development. The weight of his earlier comment and the lesson that had followed was clearly affecting him, and those around him could see that he was taking the feedback seriously. As the formal discussion began to wind down, Lieutenant General Patterson decided to address both Maria and Jake directly one final time before the group moved on to other scheduled activities. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," the general said, "I want you to know that your response to the situation this morning has been exemplary. You maintained your professionalism, focused on your mission, and demonstrated exactly the kind of character and competence that our military needs at every level. I expect that you will continue to serve as a positive example for others throughout your career." Maria felt a surge of pride and determination as she responded. "Thank you, sir. I will continue to give my best effort to serve effectively and to represent the values of our military." Lieutenant General Patterson then turned to Jake. "Petty Officer Morrison, you have an opportunity to learn from this experience and to become a better leader as a result of it. The question is whether you will take advantage of that opportunity and use what you've learned to become someone who builds others up rather than someone who tears them down." Jake straightened his shoulders and looked directly at the general as he responded. "Sir, I understand the lesson, and I commit to becoming the kind of leader who recognizes and supports excellence wherever I find it. I will use this experience to examine my own assumptions and to ensure that I contribute positively to unit effectiveness and morale." The general nodded approvingly and then addressed the entire room one final time. "What has happened here this morning represents both a challenge and an opportunity for every person in this room. You have all witnessed something that you will remember for the rest of your careers, and you now have the responsibility to take the lessons from this experience and apply them in your own leadership and your own interactions with others." As the formal discussion concluded and the group prepared to move on to other scheduled activities, the impact of the morning's events was clearly visible on everyone present. The unprecedented salute and the discussion that followed had created a moment of transformation that would influence how many of these service members approached leadership and respect for the rest of their careers. What none of them could have predicted was that this story would continue to unfold in ways that would have lasting impact, not just on the individuals involved, but on military culture more broadly. 6 months after the incident at FOB Alpha, the ripple effects of that extraordinary morning continued to spread throughout the military community in ways that none of the participants could have fully anticipated. The story of 4 general officers saluting a staff sergeant had become more than just an anecdote about respect and recognition. It had become a symbol of changing military culture and a catalyst for broader conversations about leadership, inclusion, and merit-based advancement. Maria Rodriguez found herself in an unexpected position as she returned from her deployment. Word of the incident had spread through informal military networks, and she had received recognition and opportunities that she had never sought, but that reflected the broader impact of her professional excellence and the circumstances that had brought it to such dramatic attention. Upon her return to the United States, Maria was selected for promotion to Sergeant First Class ahead of her normal timeline, a recognition not just of her technical expertise, but of her leadership potential and her representation of military values under challenging circumstances. More significantly, she was offered the opportunity to attend the Sergeant's Major Academy, a career-enhancing program normally reserved for much more senior non-commissioned officers. The assignment that followed her promotion was equally significant. Maria was posted to the Pentagon as an intelligence analyst for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a position that would put her technical skills to use at the highest levels of military planning and decision-making. It was the kind of assignment that typically came much later in a career, but senior leadership had recognized that her competence and her ability to maintain professionalism under pressure made her valuable in the most demanding environments. "I never expected any of this," Maria confided to her mentor, Master Sergeant Patricia Collins, as they discussed the opportunities and challenges that lay ahead. "I joined the Army to serve my country and to prove that I could excel in this environment. I never thought I would become a symbol of anything." Master Sergeant Collins, a 20-year veteran who had herself faced challenges as a woman in the military, provided perspective that helped Maria understand the broader significance of what had happened. "Maria, whether you sought this attention or not, You've become an example of what's possible when merit and competence are recognized and rewarded. That carries responsibility, but it also creates opportunities to influence positive change. The conversation with Master Sergeant Collins helped Maria understand that her new visibility could be used to mentor and encourage other young service members who might face similar challenges. She began speaking at military academies and training programs, sharing her experiences and emphasizing the importance of focusing on professional excellence rather than on the obstacles that others might place in their path. Meanwhile, Jake Morrison's experience had led him down a very different, but equally transformative path. The encounter with the four general officers had forced him to confront assumptions and biases that he had not fully recognized in himself, and he had committed to using that experience as a foundation for personal and professional growth. Jake requested assignment to a diversity and inclusion program within the Naval Special Warfare Command, a decision that surprised many of his colleagues, but that reflected his genuine desire to understand and address the issues that had been highlighted during his encounter with senior leadership. The assignment required him to study military culture, examine barriers to inclusion, and develop training programs designed to address bias and promote respect for all service members. I realized that morning at FOB Alpha that I had some learning to do, Jake explained to his new supervisor, Commander Lisa Thompson, as he began his assignment. I thought I was a good soldier and a good leader, but I wasn't seeing some things that were right in front of me. I want to use this assignment to become better and to help other people avoid the mistakes that I made. Commander Thompson, who was leading innovative efforts to improve culture and inclusion within the special operations community, saw Jake's transformation as exactly the kind of change that could have lasting impact. Jake, what makes your perspective valuable is that you've been through this experience personally. You understand what it's like to have blind spots and to have them exposed in a dramatic way. That gives you credibility when you talk to other service members about these issues. The work was challenging and sometimes uncomfortable for Jake as he examined his own assumptions and learned about the experiences of service members from different backgrounds. He spent time interviewing women, minorities, and other underrepresented groups about their experiences in the military, and he began to understand the cumulative effect of small slights, assumptions, and barriers that he had never noticed or considered. One of the most impactful parts of Jake's new role was developing case studies for training programs, and he found himself returning repeatedly to his own experience at FOB Alpha as an example of how bias could cloud judgment and how leadership intervention could create opportunities for learning and growth. The story of what had happened that morning had indeed spread throughout the military community, but not in the way that anyone had expected. Rather than becoming gossip or entertainment, the story had been embraced by senior leadership as a teaching tool and had been incorporated into leadership training programs across all services. Lieutenant General Patterson had authorized the creation of a case study based on the incident, with the permission of all involved parties, and it was now used in military academies and professional military education programs to illustrate principles of leadership, respect, and the recognition of merit. The case study examined not just the incident itself, but the broader cultural issues it represented and the leadership lessons it demonstrated. Major General Thompson had incorporated elements of the story into Marine Corps leadership training, emphasizing the importance of recognizing and developing talent regardless of assumptions or biases. Rear Admiral Davis had used it in special operations leadership courses to illustrate the importance of merit-based evaluation and the dangers of letting preconceptions affect professional judgment. Brigadier General Martinez had perhaps made the most extensive use of the story, incorporating it into Air Force programs designed to develop inclusive leadership and to address barriers faced by underrepresented groups in military service. She saw the incident as a perfect illustration of how senior leadership could use teachable moments to reinforce values and create lasting change. The four general officers had remained in contact with both Maria and Jake, tracking their progress and using their experiences as examples in their ongoing efforts to improve military culture and leadership development. They had all recognized that the incident at FOB Alpha represented an opportunity to demonstrate values and create change that extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. 1 year after the incident, an unexpected reunion took place at the Pentagon when Maria, now working in her new assignment, encountered Jake, who was attending a conference on diversity and inclusion in military leadership. The meeting was somewhat awkward at first, as both of them were still processing the events that had brought them together and changed the trajectory of their careers. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, Jake said formally when he first saw her in the Pentagon corridor. "I hope you've been doing well in your new assignment." Maria smiled and extended her hand. "Actually, it's Sergeant First Class Rodriguez now, and yes, the assignment has been incredible. How has your work with the diversity and inclusion program been going?" The conversation that followed was surprisingly easy and productive as both of them shared their experiences over the past year and reflected on how the incident at FOB Alpha had influenced their personal and professional development. They discovered that they had both been using their experiences to help educate and mentor other service members, and they found common ground in their commitment to creating positive change in military culture. "You know," Jake said as their conversation was winding down, "I've spent a lot of time over the past year thinking about that morning and what I learned from it. I realized that I've been so focused on my own perspective and my own experiences that I wasn't really seeing the people around me clearly." Maria nodded thoughtfully. "I think that morning was educational for all of us in different ways. I learned something about the importance of senior leadership intervention and the power of symbolic gestures to reinforce values. But I also learned that change is possible when people are willing to examine their own assumptions and commit to doing better." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Brigadier General Martinez, who was attending the same conference that had brought Jake to the Pentagon. The general was clearly pleased to see both of them and to learn about their continued professional development. "It's wonderful to see both of you thriving and using your experiences to contribute to positive change," Brigadier General Martinez said. "What happened that morning at FOB Alpha has become one of our most effective teaching tools for leadership development, and knowing that both of you are continuing to grow and contribute makes the impact even more meaningful." The general's words reminded both Maria and Jake that their story had taken on a life of its own and had become part of the broader effort to create cultural change within the military. They had both become part of something larger than their individual careers or experiences. As they reflected on the year that had passed since that extraordinary morning at FOB Alpha, both Maria and Jake recognized that a moment of disrespect and the leadership response that followed had created opportunities for learning, growth, and positive change that continued to influence their lives and the lives of others around them. The story of 4 general officers saluting a staff sergeant had become more than just an anecdote about military protocol or a lesson about respect. It had become a symbol of the military's commitment to merit-based leadership and its ongoing evolution toward a more inclusive and effective organization. For Maria, the experience had opened doors and created opportunities that she continued to use to serve effectively and to mentor others who face similar challenges. For Jake, it had catalyzed a transformation in his understanding of leadership and his commitment to creating positive change for others. And for the military as a whole, the incident had provided a powerful example of how leadership intervention at critical moments could reinforce values, create teachable moments, and contribute to lasting cultural change. The ripple effects of that single morning continued to influence leadership development, training programs, and the daily interactions of service members throughout the military community. The lesson that respect and recognition should be based on merit and competence rather than assumptions about background or demographics have been powerfully reinforced, and the commitment to creating environments where all service members could thrive and contribute their best efforts to the mission remained a priority at the highest levels of military leadership. In the end, what had begun as a moment of disrespect had become a catalyst for positive change that continued to influence military culture and leadership development long after the initial incident had passed into history.